The beast was Rage. It was the size of a war horse, all black fur and rippling muscle, with claws that tore grooves in the ancient flagstones of the Great Hall. Its eyes were molten gold, not the sharp, intelligent silver of the king, but something wilder, something broken. It had thrown two of the royal guard against a stone pillar like dolls. Another lay groaning, his leg bent at an angle that made her stomach clench. The scent of blood and ozone filled the air. The nobles, moments before laughing and drinking, were a terrified, huddled mass of silks and jewels pressed against the far wall. And the beast, the Alpha King's beast, was turning. Its massive head, dripping with saliva, swung towards the dais where Lady Lyra stood, her face a mask of pale, triumphant shock. It took a step, a low, guttural snarl vibrating through the very floor. Elara felt a strange calm settle over her. She was a scribe, a ghost who haunted the royal library, smelling of paper and dust, not a hero. Her hands were stained with ink, not blood. She was no one, but as she looked at the creature, she didn't see a monster. She saw pain, a terrible, soul-deep agony that mirrored the hollow ache in her own chest. The king was in there, Kaelin. Without thinking, without knowing why, she moved. She slipped out from behind the tapestry where she'd been observing the feast, her designated place for unimportant functionaries. Her soft-soled slippers made no sound on the stone. A guard tried to grab her arm. "Get back, girl, it'll tear you apart." She barely heard him. Her eyes were locked on the beasts. They were filled with a chaotic fire, a storm of fury she felt she could almost understand. She took another step. The beast's snarl deepened, its attention shifting from Lyra to her. A ripple of fear went through the crowd, a fool girl walking to her death. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur that was somehow not lost in the cavernous hall. The beast's ear twitched. It lowered its head, muscles coiling. It was going to charge. Something inside her, an instinct older than memory, spoke a single, simple truth. This was not chaos. This was a cry for help. She held up a hand, not in defense, but as if to say, "Stop. Sit," she commanded. The word was not loud. It was not a shout or a scream. It was quiet. It was firm. It was absolute. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The snarl died in the beast's throat, replaced by a confused whine. Every warrior in the hall, every noble, every servant, watched in stunned silence. The great beast, the untamed fury of the Alpha King, tilted its monstrous head. It looked at her, and the molten gold of its eyes seemed to clear for just a second, a flicker of pained recognition within the storm. Then, with a groan of protesting muscle and a scrape of claws on stone, it obeyed. It sat, 3 months earlier. The only light was the single candle on her desk, its flame a lonely soldier against the encroaching darkness of the royal archives. Elara dipped her quill into the pot of iron gall ink, the familiar scratch, scratch, scratch on parchment the only sound in the vast, silent chamber. She was copying a manifest of grain shipments from the southern territories, a text so mind-numbingly dull that even the mice seemed to avoid this section of the library. It was her life, dust and ink and silence. She was an orphan, a foundling left on the steps of the Pax Infirmary 20 years ago. She had no family name, no status. She wasn't strong enough to be a warrior, her senses too dull to be a hunter, her presence too forgettable to be a courtier. But she could read. She could write in 3 languages, and her script was flawless. And so, she was given a place. Not a home, but a place. The royal scribe. It sounded grander than it was. It meant she was a tool, a useful piece of furniture kept in the library. A familiar ache settled in her bones. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the drafty stone walls. It was the chill of being unseen, of knowing that if she vanished tomorrow, the only thing that would be missed was the neatness of the ledgers. Her own worthlessness was a truth she had long ago accepted. It was written on her soul as clearly as the words on the page before her. A sudden noise made her jump. The heavy oak door to the archives creaked open. No one ever came here at this hour. She instinctively shrank back into the shadows, a habit born of years of trying to be invisible. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, impossibly tall and broad. For a terrifying moment she thought it was a wraith from one of the older, darker histories she sometimes read. But then he stepped into the candlelight, and her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the Alpha King. Kaelin. She had only ever seen him from a distance, a formidable figure on the throne, or a flash of silver hair on the battlements. Up close, he was overwhelming. He wasn't handsome in the way of the younger courtiers. His face was all harsh lines and sharp angles, carved from granite and winter. His eyes, a startling pale silver, seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. He radiated an aura of absolute power, a stillness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. And he was looking directly at her. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She shot to her feet, her stool scraping loudly on the floor, and bowed her head so low her forehead nearly touched her desk. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. Scribes did not receive personal visits from the king, ever. She must have done something wrong, a misplaced comma, a miscopied date. "You are the scribe, Alara?" His voice was deep, a low rumble like distant thunder. It held no anger, only a quiet authority. "Yes, Your Majesty." She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. To look at him directly felt like staring into the sun. "I am told you read the Old Tongue." Yes, Your Majesty. A little." It was a lie, she was fluent. But claiming any sort of expertise felt dangerous, like drawing attention to herself. Silence stretched. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight. She could smell the cold night air clinging to his cloak, a scent of pine and frost that was clean and sharp. "Come with me," he said. It was not a request. Her mind raced. Where was he taking her? To the dungeons? Was she to be punished? Her hands, already stained with ink, began to tremble. She wiped them on her rough-spun tunic, a futile gesture. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked out. Alara hesitated for only a second before scurrying after him, leaving her candle and her half-finished ledger behind. She had no choice but to follow. He led her not to the dungeons, but up winding stairs she had never been permitted to use, through corridors hung with rich tapestries depicting the history of his line. The guards they passed snapped to attention, their eyes wide with surprise to see the king trailed by a small, ink-stained ghost. He brought her to the council chamber. It was empty save for a long table, and on it, an ancient leather-bound book lay open. The air was thick with tension, the lingering ghost of a difficult meeting. "This," he said, gesturing to the book. "Translate it." She approached the table cautiously. The script was archaic, a spidery, complex form of the Old Tongue she had only seen in the most forbidden texts. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a faint brown. "It speaks of the withering," she murmured, her scholarly instincts momentarily overriding her fear. "A blight that afflicted the first kings. It says the bloodline was cursed, that the king's life force would decay, slowly, from within." She looked up, and immediately wished she hadn't. His silver eyes were fixed on her, his expression unreadable, but she saw something flicker in their depths, a shadow, a confirmation, and in that moment she noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as it rested on the back of a chair. A deep, unnatural cold that seemed to radiate from him, a stark contrast to the warmth of the roaring hearth. He was dying. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. The Alpha King, the most powerful man in the world, was secretly, slowly, coming apart. "What does it say of a cure?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She forced her eyes back to the page, her heart pounding. Her fingers traced the faded lines. It speaks of a countermagic, a catalyst. Not a potion or a spell, but a person. One with the sun in their soul who could reignite the flame. She swallowed, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. It was a fairy tale, a myth. I see, he said, the words clipped. You will continue your work. I will have this book sent to your desk. Document everything you find and speak of this to no one. Yes, Your Majesty, she breathed. He turned and left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving her alone in the grand, silent room. She stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the ancient book, the echo of his cold presence still clinging to the air. Her world, once so small and contained, had just been cracked wide open, and she was terrified. That night was the beginning. The book arrived at her desk as promised, delivered by a silent guard. For the next few weeks, her life remained mostly unchanged. She spent her days in the dusty archives, deciphering the brittle pages, her nights in her small, cold cot in the servants' quarters. But everything felt different. The knowledge of the king's secret vulnerability hummed beneath the surface of her quiet life. She filled pages with her neat script, translating the legends of the Withering. The text was fragmented, allegorical. It spoke of kings who grew cold to the touch, whose wolves grew silent, whose strength faded like the setting sun. It was a slow, lonely death sentence. Her heart ached for him, a man she barely knew but whose secret burden now felt entwined with her own. Then the summonses began. First, it was a request to bring her translations to his private study. He claimed he wanted to see her progress. The study was a world away from her dusty archive. It was filled with maps and weapons, the scent of leather and wood smoke. He would sit behind a massive oak desk, pretending to read reports while she read her findings aloud in a quiet voice. She was acutely aware of his eyes on her, his silver gaze intense and searching. He never spoke of the curse directly. He asked questions about grammar, about the etymology of a certain word. But she knew. They were both circling the truth, a dark sun they couldn't bear to look at. In these moments she would see the tremor in his hand again, quickly hidden. She would feel that unnatural chill, a pocket of winter in the warm room. Then he asked her to organize the books in his study. It was a transparent excuse. The books were already perfectly ordered. But she complied, spending hours in his presence, the silence between them thick with unspoken things. She would climb a ladder to reach a high shelf and feel his gaze on her, a tangible thing. She would hand him a book, and their fingers would brush. A jolt, like lightning, would shoot up her arm. His skin was so cold. Each stolen moment was a sip of water to a woman dying of thirst. She, who had been invisible her entire life, was being seen. And by him. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. She told herself it was her duty, that he was her king and she was his scribe. But in the quiet of her room at night, she would press her fingers to her lips, remembering the brief, cold shock of his touch, and a fragile, dangerous hope would begin to bloom in her chest. The world, however, did not approve. Lady Lyra was the daughter of a powerful allied alpha. She was beautiful, sharp-witted, and it was widely understood that she was the king's intended. They had been close once, years ago, but something had fractured between them. Still, she remained at court, a constant, glittering presence at his side, her claim staked with every proprietary touch of his arm, every smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Lyra noticed Alara. At first it was a dismissive glance in a hallway, a flicker of annoyance when she saw Alara leaving the king's study. Then, the interruptions became more calculated. Ilara would be summoned to the study, only to find Lyra there with the king, discussing a border dispute. Lyra would look at Alara as if she were a piece of dirt on the rug. "The king is busy, scribe. Your dust can wait." Kalen would never contradict her in public. His face would become a mask of stone, But Alara could see the tightening of his jaw, the flash of frustration in his eyes before it was extinguished. He was politically trapped, his enemies at the borders and within his own council waiting for any sign of weakness. Lyra's father was a crucial ally he could not afford to offend. The external siege began in earnest. Lyra arranged a week-long hunt. The king had to attend. Alara spent the week in the library, the silence suddenly oppressive, the dust feeling like it was choking her. When he returned, he sought her out immediately, under the pretense of a newly discovered artifact. They had barely spoken for 10 minutes before Lyra swept in, a whirlwind of emerald silk and sharp perfume, reminding him of a diplomatic dinner he was late for. Every time they found a moment of quiet connection, the world, in the form of Lyra, would tear it away. The hope in Alara's chest began to feel like a sickness. She was a fool. A scribe, dreaming of a king. Lyra was the beautiful, powerful she-wolf at his side. She was the reality. Alara was the dust. One evening he found her in the gardens. It was late, the moon a silver sickle in the sky. She had been unable to sleep, her thoughts a tangled mess. "You are avoiding me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "I am a scribe, Your Majesty," she said, her voice small. "I have work to do." "That is not what I asked." He stepped closer. The air grew cold. "I have not had a moment's peace since I returned. Every second is filled with noise." She knew he meant Lyra. He meant the duties, the politics, the cage of his kingship. "The archives are quiet," she offered, a pathetic attempt at comfort. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above her cheek. She could feel the chill of him, a whisper of winter against her skin. "With you," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl that was almost a purr. "It is quiet with you." She leaned into the promise of his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. She wanted it more than she wanted her next breath. "Kaelin, there you are." Lyra's voice, sharp and possessive, shattered the moment. Alara flinched back, as if burned. Kaelin dropped his hand, his body going rigid. Lyra glided towards them, her smile a slash of red in the moonlight. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Alara, and they burned with a cold, triumphant fire. "The emissaries from the Stoneclaws are here. They will not speak to anyone but you." She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, pulling him away. "Come, leave the servant to her thoughts." He gave Alara one last look, a look filled with a frustration so profound it was like a physical blow. Then he was gone, swallowed by the night and his duty, with Lyra at his side. Alara stood alone in the garden, trembling. The cold he had left behind was nothing compared to the icy despair flooding her veins. It was hopeless. She was a moth dreaming of the moon, and she was going to be burned. The grand feast was meant to solidify the new alliance with the Stoneclaws. The great hall was ablaze with torchlight, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and mulled wine. Alara was stationed near a tapestry, tasked with being ready should any obscure point of history or lineage need clarification. It was a perfect position from which to be invisible. From her corner she watched Kaelin. He sat on his throne, Lyra in the seat of honor beside him. He looked magnificent, a king in full command. But she could see the truth. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his smile never reached his eyes. She saw the almost imperceptible effort it took for him to lift his heavy goblet, his hand steady only through sheer force of will. He was a brilliant star, burning himself out from the inside. The feast wore on, the wine flowed. Lyra was in her element, charming and radiant. At one point she raised her goblet. "A toast," she declared, her voice ringing through the hall. "To the king, and to the strength of his line." A chorus of "To the king!" echoed back. Lyra's eyes found Alara in the shadows. A cruel, knowing smile touched her lips. She took a deliberate step down from the dais and walked towards a servant carrying a tray of wine. With a flick of her wrist, she stumbled, sending the entire tray of crimson liquid splashing forward. directly onto the Stoneclaw emissary's pristine white furs. A gasp went through the hall. The emissary, a grim, scarred warrior, leaped to his feet, roaring in anger. It was a grave insult. "You clumsy fool!" Lyra shrieked, pointing not at the servant but directly at Ilara. "The scribe! She jostled me! She has ruined everything!" Every eye in the hall turned to Ilara. She froze, pinned by 100 hostile stares. It was a lie. A blatant, vicious lie. She hadn't moved a muscle. I didn't," she stammered, her voice a useless whisper. "She seeks to sabotage this alliance," Lyra cried, her voice rising with manufactured hysteria. "She is a spy from the Withered Peaks. Seize her!" Panic seized Ilara. Guards started moving towards her. This was it. This was how it ended. In a dungeon, forgotten. All for a spilled drink and a jealous heart. Enough. Kaelin's voice cut through the uproar like a blade of ice. He was on his feet, his silver eyes blazing with a fury that made the torchlight seem dim. It was not directed at her. It was all for Lyra. "She did nothing," he stated, his voice dangerously low. "I was watching." Lyra's face paled. "Kaelin, you would take the word of this nothing over mine?" "I would take the word of truth over a lie, whoever speaks it," he snarled. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop. The pressure of his power was immense, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. "You will apologize, to the scribe, and to our guest." Lyra stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. Humiliation warred with hatred in her eyes. "You would shame me for a creature from the dust," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You, who are fading to nothing? You think she can save you? That this little mud rat has the key?" She had gone too far. She had spoken the forbidden truth. A sound tore from Kaelin's throat that was not human. It was a raw, primal scream of rage and pain. The air shimmered around him. His bones cracked and reformed, his body contorting, expanding. Black fur sprouted from his skin. He lost control. The shift was violent, explosive. Where the king had stood, the beast now towered, a nightmare of claws and teeth. The hall erupted in screams. The beast was pure, undiluted rage. It saw Lyra, the source of its agony, and it lunged. It was in that moment of chaos, with warriors scrambling and nobles screaming, that Ilara moved. She saw the beast, and she saw the king trapped inside, drowning in his own fury. Her fear for herself vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, desperate need to reach him. She stepped into its path. "Sit," she said. And the world held its breath as the monster obeyed the ghost. The silence that followed was more deafening than the previous chaos. The beast sat on its haunches, its massive chest heaving, a low whine escaping its throat. The molten gold of its eyes was fixed on her, the storm within them momentarily calmed by her presence. Then its form began to tremble. A wave of shimmers passed over it, and with a series of sickening cracks and groans, the beast collapsed inward. The black fur receded, the monstrous form shrinking, until King Kaelin lay naked and unconscious on the stone floor, blood trickling from his nose, and a dozen small cuts where his skin had torn. He had shifted back. But he did not wake. The spell broke. The hall exploded into panicked shouts. "The king is down!" "Sorcery!" Lyra was the first to find her voice. Her face, which had been a mask of terror, twisted into one of opportunistic cunning. "She's a witch!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Ilara. "You all saw it. She enchanted him. She controlled his beast. She has cursed the king." Ilara didn't hear her. She rushed to Kaelin's side, falling to her knees on the cold stone. His skin was like ice, a deathly, unnatural cold that seeped into the floor around him. His breathing was shallow, a faint whisper of life. "Your Majesty? Kaelin?" she pleaded, her hand hovering over his chest. She couldn't bear to touch him, afraid the fragile thread of his life might snap. But the cold. It was the withering. The forced shift had accelerated it. He was dying. Right here, in front of everyone. Without thinking, she pressed her palm against his sternum. A tiny spark, a flicker of warmth, left her and entered him. It was almost nothing, a single ember in a blizzard, but she felt it go. She saw the faint tremor in his eyelids, the slight deepening of his breath. It was her. That warmth was from her. Seize the witch. Lyra's voice was iron now, full of authority. The royal guard, their loyalty confused, their king incapacitated, looked from Lyra to the unconscious Kaelin, and then to the strange, quiet scribe who had brought the beast to heel. Lyra's personal guard, loyal to her family, moved first. They grabbed Alara's arms, hauling her to her feet. "No!" Alara cried, struggling against them. "He needs help. He's cold." "He needs to be protected from you." Lyra spat, her eyes gleaming. "You will be taken to the dungeons until we can determine the nature of your dark magic." She turned to the stunned royal guard. "The king is unwell. He has been for some time. I will be taking control of the council to ensure his recovery and the stability of the kingdom. He is to be moved to his chambers. No one is to see him. For his own protection." It was a coup. A swift, brilliant coup staged in the middle of chaos, and Alara was the scapegoat. The guards dragged her away, her protests lost in the noise. Her last sight was of Kaelin's still form being lifted by his guards, his head lolling to the side, his face pale as death. The dungeons were colder than the archives, colder than the king's skin. It was a damp, lightless cold that sank into her bones and stayed there. They threw her into a cell, the heavy iron door slamming shut with a sound of finality. She was alone with her terror. Hours bled into days. They gave her bread and water, shoved through a slot in the door. No one spoke to her. The silence was a living thing, feeding her fear. Lyra's words echoed in her mind. Witch, sorcery, dark magic. Was she a witch? How had she commanded the beast? And the warmth? Where had it come from? She looked at her hands, half expecting to see them glowing. They were just her hands, pale and ink-stained. The whispers of the guards outside her cell were her only connection to the world. They spoke of the king, how he was confined to his bed, struck down by a wasting sickness. How Lyra had sealed the royal wing, allowing only her personal healer to attend him. She was isolating him, consolidating her power, and everyone believed her. They believed Alara had done this. One night, a new guard was posted outside her cell. He was older, his face lined with worry. She recognized him as one of Kaelin's personal guard, a man named Fendrel. She crept to the door. "Please," she whispered through the grate. "The king. Is he?" Fendrel glanced down the corridor, then leaned in close. His voice was a low growl. "He's fading. Lyra's healer gives him drafts that make him weaker. She says it's to fight the enchantment. She's killing him." Ice flooded Alara's veins. "You have to help him." "We can't get to him," Fendrel hissed, his frustration palpable. "Lyra's wolves are everywhere, but—" He hesitated. "The king, before they took him, when he was still barely conscious, he said one word." "What?" she breathed. "He said your name." The old guard slipped a small, folded piece of parchment through the grate. "He gave me this weeks ago. Said if anything ever happened, if he was ever compromised, I was to give it to you." Her trembling fingers unfolded the note. It was Kaelin's handwriting, strong and sharp. It wasn't a letter. It was a page torn from a history book, the same one she had translated. A section had been circled in red ink. It spoke of the sun sold, the catalyst. It said they were not witches, but the product of a dormant bloodline, an ancient lineage of healers from the withered peaks, the very place Lyra had accused her of being a spy from. The power was one of life, a direct counter to the decay of the withering curse. But the text ended with a chilling warning. The bloodline had been hunted to extinction by Kalen's own ancestors, who feared its power. To be discovered was a death sentence. This was the truth that terrified her. She was the last ember of a fire his family had tried to stamp out. Her very existence was a threat to the legitimacy of his throne. Her power to save him was also the one thing that could see them both destroyed. She sank to the floor, the parchment clutched in her hand. She was not a witch. She was something far more dangerous. And Lyra knew. Somehow, Lyra had known all along. This wasn't just jealousy. This was a calculated political move to eliminate a rival power she had somehow discovered. A scraping sound at the cell door made her look up. It wasn't the food slot. The lock was turning. The heavy door swung inward, and a figure stumbled into the darkness. It was Kalen. He looked like a wraith. He was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over the sharp bones of his face. The silver in his hair seemed to have overtaken the black. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But his eyes, though sunken, burned with a fierce, silver light. "Kalen!" she gasped, scrambling to her feet. He pushed the door shut behind him and collapsed against it, sliding to the floor. "Ilara," he breathed, the name a prayer. She rushed to him, helping him sit up. He was freezing, his body radiating a cold so intense it felt like it was leaching the warmth from her own. "How did you get here?" she whispered, her hands fluttering uselessly around him. "Fendrel caused a distraction." He coughed, a dry, racking sound. "Lyra. She thinks I'm asleep. The poison. It's slow." He met her eyes, a desperate urgency in his gaze. "She knows what you are." Her mother was a seer. She saw a threat to her daughter's ambition. She's been planning this for years. It all clicked into place. The cruelty, the sabotage, the perfectly timed accusation. "We have to get you out of here," she said, her mind racing. "We have to." "There is no out of here for me." He cut her off, his voice rough. He captured her hand, his grip surprisingly strong, his skin like ice. "The withering? It's almost done. The shift. It broke the dam. I have days. Maybe." Tears welled in her eyes. "No. Listen to me." He pulled her closer, his silver eyes boring into hers. "Lyra will kill you. Not just to get to me. Because of what you are. She can't allow your bloodline to resurface." He was fighting for every breath. "I came to get you out. Fendrel has a way. You have to run. Run to the southern peaks. They'll give you sanctuary." "Run? And leave you here to die?" The words were torn from her, raw and angry. "I will not." "You must." His voice was a harsh growl. "You will live." "What life would that be?" she cried, the tears finally falling hot against her cold skin. "A life in hiding, knowing you were gone? A life back in the dust, unseen? You saw me, Kalen. No one else ever saw me." A terrible softness entered his eyes. The fierce king, the dying man, looked at her, and all the walls he had built around his heart seemed to crumble. "That's because the first time I saw you," he whispered, his voice cracking, "in that dusty room, surrounded by forgotten things, I felt the sun. After centuries of winter, I felt the sun." He lifted his trembling hand, his icy fingers brushing a tear from her cheek. The simple touch was more intimate than any kiss. "I am so sorry, Ilara," he rasped. "I tried to fight it. The curse. It feeds on strong emotion, on love. The more I felt for you, the faster it consumed me. I tried to stay away, to protect you, to protect myself." A bitter, broken laugh escaped him. "It seems my heart was not as disciplined as my army." He leaned his forehead against hers, his breathing growing more shallow. "I cannot love you. I will not. Because I do. And it is killing me." The confession hung in the cold, dark air of the cell, a declaration of love that was also a death sentence. "Then let it," she whispered fiercely, her own hands coming up to frame his face. Let it kill you, because I would rather have this one moment with you than a lifetime of quiet in the archives. The sound of armored boots echoed down the corridor. Shouts. Fendrel's distraction was over. They were coming. Too late, Kaelin breathed, slumping against her. You have to go. No. The word was steel. I am not leaving you. The cell door burst open. Lyra stood there, flanked by two of her largest guards. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Touching. Truly. Her eyes raked over Kaelin's collapsed form, a flicker of triumph in their depths. It seems the king's affections are as misplaced as his strength. Get away from him, Alara snarled, shielding Kaelin with her own small body. Lyra laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Oh, I'm not going to kill him, not yet. I'm going to let the withering do its work. But you are an inconvenience that needs to be removed. She nodded to her guards. Take her. They moved forward. Kaelin tried to rise, to summon his beast, but he let out a choked gasp and fell back, clutching his chest. He was too weak. Alara looked from his pained face to Lyra's triumphant one. This was it. The end. She would die here, in this dungeon, and he would die alone in his room. And Lyra would win. No. A fire ignited in her soul, a rage so pure and hot it burned away all her fear. She would not let this happen. She would not let this woman take him from her. As the guards reached for her, she did the only thing she could think of. She turned to Kaelin, the dying king who had seen her when no one else had. She cupped his face in her hands, ignoring the deathly chill of his skin. I'm sorry, she whispered, for the choice she was about to make, and she kissed him. The moment her lips touched his, the world dissolved into light. It was not a gentle warmth. It was a supernova. A torrent of pure life, of raw, untamed solar energy erupted from her. It was the power of 1,000 sunrises, the life force of a spring forest, the heat of a forged star, all held dormant inside her for 20 years, and now it was free. The light exploded outwards, throwing the guards back against the far wall of the corridor. Lyra screamed, shielding her eyes from the blinding radiance. The stone walls of the dungeon glowed, the dampness sizzling into steam. But the heart of the storm was the point of contact between them. The power poured from Alara into Kaelin, a flood of liquid gold. It was not a gentle healing, it was a violent purge. It surged through his veins, hunting the cold, the decay, the ancient curse of the withering. It burned away the shadows, incinerated the blight, and battled the icy tendrils of death that had wrapped themselves around his heart. She felt his body convulse in her arms. He cried out, a sound of agony and ecstasy, as centuries of cold were forcibly ejected from his very soul. The chill radiating from him was replaced by a furnace heat. The tremor in his limbs ceased. The shallow breaths became a deep, powerful intake of air. Through the blinding light, she saw it. The silver in his hair receded, replaced by the raven black of his youth. The gaunt lines of his face filled out, color flooding his skin. Strength, raw and primal, poured back into his muscles. The king was being reforged in her fire. She broke the kiss, gasping for breath, the light slowly receding, coalescing within her until it was a steady, golden hum beneath her skin. She was no longer trembling. She felt solid, whole. The hollow ache she had carried her entire life was gone, filled with a roaring sun. Kaelin's eyes opened. They were no longer a pale, washed-out silver. They were the color of a stormy sky, sharp and clear and crackling with power. He looked at her, not with confusion, but with utter awe. Ilara, he breathed. He was whole. He was healed. He was alive. He surged to his feet, pulling her up with him. He was no longer a dying wraith. He was the Alpha King, radiating a power that made the stone tremble. He stood before her, naked and magnificent, a warrior god reborn. Lyra stared, her face a grotesque mask of horror and disbelief. No. Impossible. The curse is absolute. Kalen turned his gaze on her, and the temperature in the corridor plunged. But it was not the cold of the withering. It was the cold of a king's wrath. My curse, he said, his voice a low, deadly thunder, was broken the moment I chose to love her. Her power just reminded my body how to live. He took a step forward, and Lyra flinched back. You tried to murder your king. You used his affliction as a weapon. You harmed his mate. His mate. The words echoed in the silence, a pronouncement, a claiming. Guards! Lyra shrieked, but her men were groaning on the floor, stunned. Fendrel and the rest of the royal guard, drawn by the commotion and the impossible light, now filled the corridor. They saw their king, strong and whole, and the scribe glowing with a soft golden light. They looked at Lyra, and they saw a traitor. Seize her, Kalen commanded, and this time, the guards obeyed without hesitation. Lyra struggled as they grabbed her. You cannot do this. My father. Your father will be informed that his daughter is a traitor and a would-be kingslayer, Kalen said, his voice like ice. He can consider himself fortunate that I do not declare war on his entire line for your poison. He looked at the woman who had caused them so much pain. Take her away. She will await my judgment. As they dragged her off, screaming threats and curses, Kalen turned back to Alara. The hall was silent save for their breathing. He was still holding her hand, his skin now warm and vibrant against hers. He looked down at himself, then at her. A slow, wondering smile spreading across his face. It was the first true smile she had ever seen from him, and it was like watching the sun rise after a lifetime of winter. It seems I am in need of some clothes, he said, his voice laced with a humor she had never heard before. And a queen. Tears of relief, of joy streamed down her face. He reached out and gently wiped them away, his thumb warm against her cheek. You are the sun, Alara, he whispered, his stormy eyes full of a love so profound it took her breath away. My son. She had been a ghost, a creature of dust and shadows, but in his eyes, she was a sunrise, and for the first time in her life, she felt she was finally home. 3 months later, the world was green again. The unnatural chill that had subtly plagued the kingdom for years had vanished, replaced by a vibrant warmth that seemed to emanate from the castle itself. The crops were fuller, the people healthier. They whispered that the new queen had a sun in her soul, and she had shared it with the land. Alara stood on the balcony of their chambers, the morning sun warming her face. She was no longer dressed in the rough spun of a scribe, but in a simple gown of deep blue that matched the color of the summer sky. She was the queen, but the title still felt foreign on her tongue. The reality, however, felt more natural than breathing. A pair of strong, warm arms wrapped around her from behind. Kalen rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath tickling her ear. He was no longer the cold, distant king. The withering had been burned out of him, and with it had gone the icy walls around his heart. He was warm, and he laughed often, a deep, rumbling sound that made her own heart sing. What is my queen thinking about so seriously? He murmured, his lips brushing her temple. I was thinking about the archives, she admitted, a soft smile on her face. About how I used to believe my entire world was contained in that dusty room. And now? She turned in his arms, looping hers around his neck. She looked up into his face, still marveling at the life and warmth in it. Now I know my world is right here. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss full of lazy morning sunlight and a love that was no longer a death sentence, but a source of infinite strength. The bond between them was a palpable thing, a current of gold and silver, sun and storm, woven together. Does it hurt? She had asked him once, weeks after the incident, tracing the new, healthy lines of his face. He had captured her hand and pressed it to his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady. Not anymore, he had answered, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra had been exiled, stripped of her name and titles, sent to a barren convent on the northern islands. Her father, shamed and fearing the king's wrath, had sworn fealty and sent a fortune in reparations. The kingdom was secure. The enemies, both internal and external, had been silenced, but their new life was not about politics or power. It was about the quiet moments. It was about sharing a meal, their knees brushing under the table. It was about him finding her in the library, her library now, bright and airy and filled with sunlight, and simply sitting with her in comfortable silence while she read. It was about waking in the middle of the night to find him watching her, his eyes full of a fierce, protective love that still made her ache. He pulled back from the kiss, his stormy eyes searching hers. "I have a gift for you." He led her back into their chambers. On a small table sat a book. It was bound in new, soft leather, but she recognized the shape of it. It was the old, brittle tome from the archives, the one that had started everything. She opened it. The crumbling pages had been painstakingly preserved, and laid within them were new pages, filled with her own neat, flawless script, her translations. But at the end, there was a new entry, written in Kaelin's strong, bold hand. It read, "And so the withering was ended. Not by a spell or a sword, but by a quiet scribe with the sun in her soul, who saw a king instead of a monster, and who reminded him how to live. She is Alara, the sun-souled, the fire-hearted, my queen, my mate, my life." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Kaelin." "Our history needed a new chapter," he said softly, "one with a happy ending." She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, pine and warmth and home. She was not a ghost anymore. She was not a tool. She was not invisible. She was a queen. She was a mate. She was loved. And in the arms of the king whose beast had bowed to her command, she was finally, completely whole.